This is the Physical Activity Researcher Podcast, a podcast for researchers of sedentary behavior, physical activity, and sports. Join for a relaxed dialogue about research design, practicalities, and, well, anything related to research. Learn from your fellow researchers useful and relevant information that does not fit into formal content and limited space of scientific publications. And here is your host.
Welcome everyone. This is the Meaningful Sport podcast, and I am your host, Noora Ronkainen. Meaningful Sport is a series of discussions on the why and how involvement in sport and physical activity can be an important part of a life worth living. If you are interested in the theme, you might also want to check out meaningfulsport.com. There you can find podcast show notes, read a blog, and access many resources for further explorations of meaningful sport. In today's episode, we are focusing on the spiritual dimension in sport. This is one of the key strands of my own research, and together with my PhD supervisor, Dr. Mark Nesti, whose work has been foundational in this area, we have written a book together with the title Meaning and Spirituality in Sport and Exercise, Psychological Perspectives. Mark was already a guest in the podcast a couple of months ago, where he discussed sport and meaning under the COVID pandemic, drawing on his work in existential psychology. After the recording, we thought that we should definitely dedicate another episode to the topic of spirituality in sport, which has been our shared interest. Olli Tikkanen has kindly agreed to host the episode for us so that we can discuss with Mark the work we've done together. So I'll hand this now over to Olli, and thanks Olli for hosting the episode.
Thank you, Noora. It is a pleasure to host this chat with both of you. I've studied myself biomechanics and exercise physiology, but also some sports psychology, but I never came across anything related to spirituality during those studies. So this is somewhat a marginal topic, and I would be interested knowing how you got interested in this topic. And Mark, your work has been foundational to the study of spirituality in sports psychology. So would you like to start with this one?
Thanks, Olli. I suppose that's part of the problem with something like spirituality. It's probably quite an important point to make straight away. And this might be one of the reasons, there are many, but one as to why it's probably been overlooked in our field, in psychology, but probably sports psychology even more so. And I would say that trying to define exactly what spirituality is, if you like, trying to speak about it in a way that is recognizable to everybody is a much harder task than in many other areas of psychology. For example, if I speak about motivation or confidence, you're reasonably confident that a number of people would have a good idea of what those concepts are and what exactly you're talking about. So the first thing to say, Olli, is that even though it might seem a bit tedious and long-winded, and I'm not going to do this now because there's a decent amount of writing on this, obviously outside of sport, but within sport, is to try and actually say what spirituality refers to. So I would say, as an opening gambit from me, one of the interesting things about spirituality is that you can view it either associated with a religious perspective, whatever that religion happens to be. So if you like, it's got an interest in transcendence. Speaking more ordinary language, it's an account about what happens in terms of life and ultimately death. So a kind of religious way of viewing spirituality, and also this word and terminology around it can be used in relation to a non-religious account. And usually there we talk about meaning, about life meaning, and also even more ordinary words. And I will stop at this point because there's so much that we could delve into from here. But words like love, massively powerful word in every part of life, and including in sport, and words like courage, which can't be easily described as, if you like, a psychological construct and nothing else. So there are some words, there are some ideas, if you like, that are more grounded in human spirituality. And then there's obviously, as I said, a whole tradition that is related to religious spirituality.
Yeah, I think that was a really nice opening clarification for some of the difficulties we have and what we've debated and discussed several times with Mark. I guess from my own part, just to say that because I studied theology and not psychology as when I first started my university studies, and I did a master's degree in theology. And I mean, in that field and that discipline, it's very normal, so to speak, to talk about spirituality, and there were not like a lot of problems with that. And so towards the end of my studies, I became quite interested in these ideas about the spiritual dimension in our everyday lives. And for example, there's a Catholic theologian called Rahner who has written about this everyday mysticism. And then it was kind of my personal interest to start looking at that spiritual dimension in our everyday life, which involves sport. And I was reflecting on my own experiences of running, and that was my start of how I started studying that when I moved to the field of sports psychology. And I think a funny background story for that also to mention is that when I started doing the first literature searches, when I started looking into my master's thesis in sports psychology, so I looked at sport and spirituality, and there was a book that was published in 2007. Sport and Spirituality is the title, and I started my studies 2009, and I went to ask for the librarian to can they order the book because we didn't have it at the university. And so she ordered the book for me. I started reading, and there were 2 or 3 chapters on spirituality and sports psychology, and somebody called Mark Nesti had written those chapters, and that was basically my entry into these questions in sports psychology, and there wasn't a lot of other literature out there at the time. So yeah, I can probably say how delighted I was then that we met with Mark, I think in Copenhagen, something like 2011 or 12, and then how Mark, you became my PhD supervisor, and then off we went to do more work on this together. So yeah.
That was a strange and really fortuitous little connection that we had, Noora, because I didn't realise that was going to happen, of course, when I was in Copenhagen, in Denmark. So that was facilitated by someone. We don't need to mention him, but he facilitated that, and I think, but it's quite pertinent to what we're talking about. And I think part of the reason that he could see that would be a connection between us was because he had a pretty broad perspective himself in relation to psychology. He could see that psychology included more than, if you like, just the very reductionist, empiricist type perspectives. That psychology is notorious, if you want to put it in those terms. I think it's just extremely attractive, the fact that there are so many different perspectives, from a very natural science perspective, a very, usually quantitative perspective, an experimental perspective, way out to what looks like the other side, and we can argue that it probably isn't, but way out to the other side of the continuum, where we're talking about holistic perspectives. We're talking about some of the work that, say, somebody like Carl Jung and the Jungian psychologists would be interested in. So you mentioned mysticism, Noora, in relation to sport as well. But obviously they were interested in it in relation to a whole host of other domains of life. So I think that one of the other attractions for me was to reflect on my own reality of doing a lot of applied work, was that there seemed to be, not in all cases, but in many cases, particularly at a high level, a considerable interest in some ideas that were best located within more spiritual type literature in psychology. So I'm sure we'll talk about these in a minute, but and I don't want to lead you off somewhere that we don't necessarily need to go just yet. But some of the work from Michael Murphy, I know you've been really generous mentioning the book that I was involved with a number of other academics in the UK, which was fantastic to do. But Michael Murphy and in the Zone in the 70s, Ken Ravizza around the same time, looking at flow, looking at peak experiences. So there were some, particularly in the States, there were one or two people who'd actually drawn on a broader perspective in psychology and looked at, if you like, the discipline from a more holistic perspective, and included, certainly in relation to performance, spiritual accounts and spiritual ideas. So then that seemed to disappear. It's true. It seemed to fall off the radar, and then meeting yourself with your theological background, and in the UK working with somebody, Professor Jim Parry from Leeds University, who had a philosophy background and was interested in a number of areas. I'm certainly interested in areas like Zen, and then a member of the clergy who was also an academic, an Anglican cleric, and a professor who drew obviously on a more theologically informed version. And then when we were at York St John at that time, another colleague, Nick Watson, who was drawing on a particular perspective within Christianity to inform some of his writing. So it was a nice coming together of a number of disciplines, if you want to put it in academic terms, and you obviously have been very much part of that in the work that you've done since.
Yeah, so very interesting story how you ended up working together and writing the book. So as Mark said, there's the religious perspective on spirituality, but also non-religious about meaning, love, courage, and other things. So how is the spirituality in contemporary society, and what are the difficulties in defining and studying it? Noora, would you like to go first with this one?
Yeah, thanks, Olli. So I think Mark already gave a nice introduction to some of these difficulties you will have, and it's certainly not the easiest topic or concept for us to be researching. And just to say that kind of in the Finnish context, when I did my first study on spirituality in running, in Finnish language there isn't like a very good word for what we use word spirituality. So there's something that is a little bit more like mental or psychological even, and the other word is more like religious. So sometimes people would very much associate spirituality with religion, and if they are not religious, then they would consider that that's not necessarily something that they would relate to, the idea of spirituality outside of religion. Whereas in some other cultural contexts, there is a lot more not popular, but let's say that it's more common for people to understand spirituality that is much broader than religion. And certainly existential psychology has had this conceptualization of spirituality that is something that is relevant for all humankind and not just religious people. And when we were writing the book together with Mark, we were more drawing on this broader notion of spirituality that is something that is related to existential meaning making. So whether my life has purpose, why are we here, these kind of big existential questions. Then this sense of transcendence, this sense of connection, that you have these moments when you feel a sense of unity and connection to the world and others around you, or this sense of we have all these moments. Some would call it flow, some would call it runner's high and peak experience, and those things that Mark also mentioned already. So we wanted to include that as well. So we wanted to take a very broad starting point to our inquiry. And I guess the last thing before handing over to Mark, I think it's very important to say that the ways that spirituality is understood in different cultural contexts is very different as well. So when we are writing our book, we are bound to our Western background and our understanding that is based on our cultural context. And we are very aware that in other cultural contexts, the way that people think about spirituality and religion is certainly different.
I think you've covered an awful lot of key points there, Noora, and I've just pick up on 2 or 3 just to keep developing these ideas. So the cultural issue, we were really aware of this when we wrote our book together, and I remember we had conversations at times, making sure that we acknowledged that in the book, that this was the context that we knew best, which was a Western context, in more specific terms, a Finnish and a British perspective, but more really accurately, it was a Western perspective that we're drawing on, and that we made the point, and we certainly discussed this, which I think is actually really quite exciting, is that the Western perspective is the minority perspective in the world. I don't know what the population at the moment is of the world. I forget. Is it 7 or 8 billion? I lose track sometimes. But it's certainly much, much, much bigger than those who are typically considered to be in the Western context. The Western context is a minority population, and the majority population of the world still, compared to the West, retains a strong connection to both religious spirituality in terms of religious practice and how important that is in their lives, and alongside that, and in place of it sometimes, but alongside that, a human spirituality. These terms, spirit, spirituality, you're quite right, Noora, that how they're expressed, lived, encountered, is very much dependent on the individual culture and history and traditions and all those other sorts of factors. Although what's also exciting, and maybe this is something that might emerge in future work, you would imagine that there would be common elements as well. If you just take a word like love, you could imagine that there will be some very different ways of understanding that in different contexts, but there will also be some very shared understanding of what that actually might mean. So there's some really interesting and exciting things still to do, but that was one of the interesting things for me, and that tied in nicely to some of my applied work, particularly over all these years, last 20 years, doing bits and pieces of work in first team environments in English Premiership football, where increasingly many players would be from other parts of the world, not European and Western contexts, and not all, of course, not all, but many of them would express in sessions with me that their spiritual, either religious worldviews or sometimes just an openness to spiritual concepts and words, that would be really hugely important in their identity, in who they were, and therefore how they lived and how they dealt with all the challenges of being an elite professional athlete. So I think that's really important. And then just to finish, you also said, Noora, there about existential psychology, and that was one of the interesting things as to why we both popped up in Denmark, neither of us having any Danish connections, I believe. And in modern times, probably Søren Kierkegaard is the person most associated with that strand of writing in philosophy and theology to some degree, and psychology. And that the attraction for us of the existential perspective is that it was taking a very holistic view of what a human person is, and either explicitly or implied was that we are a mind, a body, and a spirit, and that the spiritual dimension is as real as, if you like, the other two, if I could put it in such terms. And so existential psychology, phenomenological psychology as well, there's a sort of different slant. And I did mention Jung, but certainly for us, existential psychology, particularly the writers who have been like Viktor Frankl, Van Kam. There's been a number who've been much more open and have highlighted existential psychology's openness to ideas of spirit and spirituality and associated terms. So that I would recommend, if anybody's listening here and wants to know where to go and do some further reading, I'd recommend that that's a good place to start.
Yeah, so you were telling about cultural differences, how people understand spirituality, and I can clearly see, as Noora said, that in Finnish language we don't have, and as that is my mother tongue, it's sometimes a little bit difficult for me also. It's easier to understand in English, and probably some of the listeners might be still struggling what is spirituality and what is not. So Mark, could you explain a little bit more, like why do you consider that, for example, love is spirituality and not something else? I think many of the listeners haven't thought that it's spirituality.
Okay. So just maybe back to your initial point there, Ollie, about the restrictions of language in different cultures, and I mean that's hugely interesting in psychology, but and cultural psychology, but obviously would have implications in every aspect where psychology is relevant, including sport. So that's a really an interesting dimension maybe for somebody to pursue and look at. And that I never understood that until I met both of you. And then thought, oh wow, that's quite different to English, because English is a strange language. That's most people who know about these things know that English is essentially a combination of Germanic language and Latin, and so we have the benefit of, if you like, of the much of Europe pouring itself into one language that gives it all sorts of strengths and facility that maybe some of the languages don't have. And one of the interesting things about spirit is that word spirit, spirituality, is from the Latin spiritus. And spiritus actually means wind. And it's like, well, that's a strange connection. How on earth does that come in here? And in a way, without sounding too poetic now and taking us down another path altogether, and there's been writers in all of the arts who've written about love, which is what your question is, and trying to describe exactly what this is, and it's not that far. This may sound very far-fetched, but it's not that far from talking about something like, well, what actually is wind, because you can reduce it. You can reduce lots of terms, if you like, to a mathematical, a physics-based account, and yet somehow you still are unable to fully capture that term. You could, if you imagine that, I know it sounds rather strange, but if it's something so common, so understood by everyone, everybody's lived and experienced it, and if you say, well, here's wind, and here's what it means in terms of physics, and here's what it means in terms of maths, and it's like, but that's not what it actually means when it's lived. And so if I could extend to much more powerful word, maybe one of the most powerful, if not the most powerful words that we have in humankind, and love. When somebody tries to describe to you that love is just a biochemical reaction, and it's caused by movement of neurons in the brain, and here's a mathematical equation that can capture what love is, you're only being sold part of the story, if anything at all. So one of the interesting things about words like love is that when you come to define them, and that's not done in an easy sentence, that's done in books and books and books and different accounts, and in the end it's never completed, which I know is very frustrating for somebody who's got a maths background, because it's like, well, where is the answer? And it's like, no, we will not get to a complete answer, but we'll get to a better answer, a better account. And love is best accounted for in terms of something that is not something you could reduce to its parts. It's greater than its parts. And it's like, well, where's your evidence for that? And it's like, the evidence for that is what that idea, what that word creates in human living, in every aspect of human living, including sport. Creates all sorts of incredible things, which in many ways are not even rational. In simple terms, they don't make sense. Unbelievable levels of commitment, unbelievable levels of self-sacrifice and selflessness. And all of these words can be talked about by psychologists in terms of cognitive constructs. But if you take the phenomenological view, which is, no, here's a real word that is probably slightly differently expressed, maybe across cultures, but actually shared. Let's take the one that we're pretty sure we know this exists in normal and healthy situations, the love of the mother for their child. I know there's plenty of other versions of love, but just that particular encounter, this word defies reduction to, as I say, a number of cognitive constructs and biochemistry. So the argument, if you like, is more about what's missing in the description rather than expecting you're going to come to a complete and total account of something. So it's those sorts of words that typically writers throughout history and place have described as being an indication that we are not mere matter. We cannot be reduced to our biochemistry. We cannot be reduced just to our physiology. We are something much more than this. And a word like love would encapsulate that. And I know that is a description that will be very unsatisfactory to a lot of people. But that's the difficulty of speaking about something that is so well known to us. It's well known to all of us. It's not abstract in its real sense. We encounter this in our lives, or have done. And yet you can't fully, completely, totally describe what it is. But more accurately, and that's what I'm arguing, you can certainly describe what it's not. And so that leaves a small number of words, but a number of words where you would say, no, these words, or certain traditions will have said this, and certain perspectives in psychology would say, no, these words describe a form of human behavior that we will call love, because the following things happen, or this is how it's felt, and this is how it's experienced in terms of thoughts. So it's looking for, and I say, not everything falls into this category, of course it doesn't, but it's looking for words that are not possible to fully explain by the usual way, the usual channels. And nobody, and absolutely nobody, has yet come up with, and they never will, come up with the perfect, complete definition of a word like love. And so it's that type of level of human word that connects to human experience that suggests there's something else. Whatever that else may be, a religious person would say, that's God. God is love, love is God. And that would be articulated in different ways. Somebody who doesn't subscribe to that would say it suggests that life is about something more than just our material day-to-day existence. That experiences and meaning are much more important than just our material experiences. So it's those types of words, Ollie, and just listen to how hard I've had to work to try and explain this. And now you can see the frustration of people who want a quick, easy answer. Imagine the frustration of somebody who says, I want you to quantify this, please, Mark. I mean, that's just incredible to ask that question. It's a complete misunderstanding. Or imagine the frustration of someone who says, look, that's very good, but can you give me this in one paragraph? And it's like, no, it cannot be reduced. It's not that you can't see meaningful things about it. You can, but you can't complete the task. And that's okay. That's what, that's what philosophers spend their time doing. They rarely, if ever, say that they've completed a task. It's always open to a better account. But it doesn't mean that anything counts. It doesn't mean that it can be anything. It still means we work towards something. So that's a really, really powerful word that most people take for granted, which is a good sign. That's normal. And yet when you sit down and start thinking about it, you just know love does not mean something like motivation. It does not mean something like desire and determination. It's something bigger than that, which is why we use it usually quite carefully.
Yeah, and just a little bit continue from that. I think it's exactly what you talked about is one of the reasons why sports psychology hasn't considered spirituality too often, because spirituality as a concept doesn't really fit into a natural scientist logic of, and sports psychology has been historically striving to establish itself as a credible discipline by that we can measure things and we can show that if you do this and that, this will lead to improvement in performance and that kind of things. And if spirituality is something that cannot be even defined, or you cannot give one sentence about what it is, then how are you going to study that? And of course, for us to be researching something, we need to have an idea what we are studying. But just to say that what I did when I was becoming quite frustrated with this question was that I also enjoy reading, for example, Tao Te Ching, so the Taoist book by Lao Tzu, and it's this very strange sayings, and I mean the famous part of it is that the Tao that can be described is not the enduring and the unchanging Tao, and the name that can be named is not the enduring and unchanging name. And I also enjoy reading like Zen Buddhism, and they have these paradoxical problems that they put out there, and they refuse to conceptualize and define things. So it's something that you need to somehow just, reach the right answer without people conceptualizing for you what is going on. So just thinking about spirituality through that as well has been kind of one way that I am approaching these questions.
I think that's really interesting, Nora, because you've mentioned a piece of literature there, and I'm familiar with some of that, and the Eastern, let's just call it the Eastern perspective. It may be described as something else now, but when we're talking about Tao and Zen and Kung Fu and martial arts in general, and how those have been approached, and the great masters of martial arts, whether it be Aikido, Jiu-Jitsu, Kung Fu, different forms of karate, that many of them would claim that these activities that are hugely physical, that require incredible technical skill, but they would claim that there's a spiritual element, and possibly, from certainly what I've read, I think they would claim that the spiritual element is absolutely fundamental and central to the best performance. And so you think, well, so there's been a tradition there. And I think it's very unfortunate, personally, that the Western tradition of spirituality, which people typically in the West have associated just with a religious worldview, and if I'm not of that particular religious worldview, then I can't engage. And that's such a missed opportunity, such a shame, because there are spiritual traditions. I work with an American, he's a professor of sports psychology and a Catholic priest. His name is Father Pat Kelly. And he obviously is a Jesuit, which means he uses Ignatian spirituality, which is a particular way of developing, it's much more than this, but developing an approach to your life that is grounded in a spiritual way of being. And when you look at that and you see it, it's of course not exactly the same as other religious and spiritual traditions, but there's much that's shared. And you've just described some of that, Nora. So I think it's really exciting that we've got, if you like, Western and Eastern, or right across the world, a better way to describe it, versions of spiritual psychology in action. And just to finish the other point you made, I think tying into the other point that, in terms of the difficulties psychology and therefore sports psychology has had around these sorts of terms, and the desire to quantify and to have, psychometrics that measure spirituality in sport, which do exist, and some of us are very uncomfortable with that. I certainly am. And it's like, well, I'd like to encourage psychologists and sports psychologists particularly to read more philosophy. Particularly in relation to this, philosophical accounts that are open to, some of the ideas we are speaking about now, and can give another perspective, a different grounding in terms of why this is a legitimate area, in terms of why this has been a topic throughout the history of time, as far as we can see. And you have to ask the question, phenomenologically speaking, why is that the case? Why would people make something up just for, no reason at all? It has to be something that is grounded in our everyday lives and our encounters with life and death and meaning and the other words we've used. So I would say that, back to your point of the difficulty for psychology and sports psychology particularly, is that I'd like our discipline, or more people in our discipline, to step away at times and if not read theology, which is one of the great strengths you have, certainly go into some of the philosophical work that will allow you to have a better grasp of legitimacy of this type of idea.
Yeah, thanks. Really, really good points from both Noora and Mark. And Mark, I loved your explanation why love is spirituality. I think it was really, really good that it's the words that really escape our explanation, or which are difficult to reduce to something. And I think love is interesting that in modern Western society, you need to be rational in most of the things, but we still have special positions for love.
Thanks for joining us this week on Physical Activity Researcher Podcast. If you like the show, make sure you never miss an episode by subscribing or following the show on Twitter. This podcast is made possible by listeners like you. Thank you for your support. If you found value in the show, we would really appreciate a rating on Apple Podcast or whichever app you're using. Or if you would, in a real old school way, simply tell a friend about the show. It would be a great help for us. We have a fantastic lineup of guests for forthcoming episodes, so be sure to tune in. Thank you all for your support and have a great day.